Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our worship service. It's Sunday, April 19th. It's 1 week after Easter. We're sheltering in place. We're sheltering in God. And although we can't meet here in our beautiful sanctuary, we are together in Christ. And as I look around the sanctuary, I am remembering each one of you. I'm thankful for every single one. Well, welcome everyone again to our Shelter in Place service. This is week 5 now. Yeah, it's the 5th week of me standing here. And as the weeks go on, I miss you even more. First couple of weeks it was kind of a challenge, and now it's, you just look out and it's like, how long is this going to be? So we are now on the first Sunday after Easter, and the passage that I'm going to read to you is from John chapter 20, and this is in the email that I sent you. And by the way, if any of you would like to do a reading for me, with a little film clip behind it, let me know, and I'll give you next week's reading, which I'll tell you in advance is going to be about the disciples on the road to Emmaus, which is an amazing text. It's one of my favourite ones. But this is a good one too. This is all about doubting Thomas, although it wasn't just Thomas that doubted. They all doubted on Easter. But he's the one that gets remembered for doubting. So this is a reading from John chapter 20, and we're beginning at verse 19. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jewish religious leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And after he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails in my hand, in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. And although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands, and reach out your hand and put it in my side, and do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus said to him, "You have believed because you have seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Amen. So that was from John chapter 20. Yeah, it's interesting, and I did mention this last week, that the first reaction was confusion and fear and doubt. Remember on Easter Sunday morning? I mean, when they went to the empty tomb, it's always the first reaction is fear, doubt. They don't believe. And so all the stories, you'll notice, all the narratives from beginning on Easter morning and then into the first week and then into the next again weeks, they're the same thing. It's always about people not really seeing things very clearly, not believing and filled with doubt. So after Mary Magdalene found the stone was removed from the tomb, this is after Peter and all the other disciples see the empty tomb, and then after Mary meets Jesus in the garden, all of this has happened. This is the timeline. That's all happened. It's a week later now. They're all hiding. They're still frightened. I mean, they're still frightened because maybe they could end up on a cross too, right? That's what they're thinking. If Jesus died on the cross on Friday and they are his followers, what would stop them from ending up being arrested and dying on the cross? So they're scared. And they're behind these locked doors. And the first half of the narrative that I read takes place on Sunday night, Easter Sunday night. So Luke adds a little bit, and Luke tells us that no one really believed the women when the women said that the tomb was empty and that they had met the resurrected Jesus. So it wasn't just Thomas that had troubles believing that Jesus was alive. They all had their trouble in different ways. So on the first Easter night, the disciples are, John tells us, hiding. The door's locked. It's Easter night. Suddenly Jesus appears. He says something that he always said to them when he met them. Peace be with you. He probably said it because they didn't have any peace, right? Because they're scared. Peace be with you. And I'm sure many of us can relate to that because, just like the disciples. I mean, it's hard to have peace when you don't know what's going on, right? It's hard to have peace when you don't understand what's happening in your world, or when you think that your world is falling apart. So, I can relate to the disciples. Now, when that happened on Easter Sunday night, Thomas wasn't present. So we're presuming that the 10 were present, but Thomas isn't there. Of course, the others tell him afterward what happened. They're hiding in this room. The door's locked. Jesus appears. He speaks to them. Actually, he breathes on them and empowers them, but that's for another talk. But Thomas listened to what they had to say and said, basically, well, you can believe what you want. That may have been your experience, but it's not mine. And Thomas said, unless I actually see it for myself, unless I actually touch his hands, where the nails were, touch his side, I don't believe that he's alive. So, in other words, Thomas is looking for proof. It's not enough for someone else to experience that Jesus is alive. He wants to experience it for himself, which in some ways you can't really blame him. I mean, actually, in some ways it's still the same today, because it doesn't really matter if someone else believes or if someone else says God is alive and real. I mean, when it gets right down to it, it's like, well, have you experienced it for yourself? Is it your experience? Or is it someone else's? So Thomas wants proof. And I think a lot of people find Thomas encouraging because he brings an honesty to the story. And he's longing for this proof that many, many people can relate to this. Like, I want to experience God for myself. It's not enough for me that my parents believed or my grandparents believed or I was born into the church or whatever. That's not enough. I need to know myself. So that's what happened on Easter Sunday night. Now, a week later, the next again Sunday, 8 days later, Jesus goes looking for Thomas. Jesus goes looking for Thomas. Right? Why? Because he's the one that needs the encouragement. Now, this is so like God. It's that whole idea of never mind that there's 99 sheep here. There's one sheep that's missing, and it's the one that's missing that Jesus goes after. It's almost like Jesus is saying, okay, Thomas, what do you need? What do you need? Because I'm coming to find you. And when I find you, what do you need? Do you need to touch? Do you need to see? Do you need to put your finger in the mark where the nails were? What do you need? It's, this is how God is. God seems to go after us on an individual level, as well as a much larger level. I mean, there's the whole idea of the new creation and the new heavens and the new earth, but in some ways these stories are very, very personal. They're about individuals. They're about Jesus going out after individuals. And so, again, and we've seen this before, it's like Jesus is saying, I'll meet you where you are. I'll meet you where you are, doubts and all. But I'm coming after you, because you're important to me. And when I find you, I know what you need. So 8 days later, the disciples are gathered together again, and Jesus appears, and this time Thomas is present. And he looks at Thomas and he says to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, see my side, and reach out and touch me, and don't doubt but believe. And it's really a command in the original language. Believe, don't doubt, don't continue to doubt, but believe. And then Thomas is, verse 28, my Lord and my God. It's the whole confession thing. It's like, yeah, you are who you say you are. You are who you say you are. And then Jesus said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe. Now that's for us, that's the later generations. So in some ways he's saying to Thomas, yeah, that's good that you believe, that you've seen me and that you believe. But blessed are those who do not see but believe. See, the funny thing about proof is, of any kind, it doesn't matter what kind of proof it is. If you've ever experienced a healing, or if you've ever experienced what you would classify as a miracle, you think, I just cannot imagine how that could have happened unless God was in that, whatever it would be. Some of us have experienced these things. The things about proofs and miracles and visions and signs of various kinds is, they're very limited. They're limited in their capacity to keep us strong in the faith. Because what can often happen is, with any kind of divine encounters, is that once you get away from the healing or the phenomena or whatever it is, you're 2 or 3 years down the road, you can start to second guess things very easily. Well, maybe it was just a coincidence. Well, maybe I would have gotten better anyway. Well, maybe there's other explanations why things happen. You see, John, in his whole gospel, he doesn't even call them miracles, he calls them signs. Because for John, the purpose of a sign, the purpose for Jesus' signs or miracles, is really to give us information about what kind of God we have. They tell us something about God. So healing miracles tell us that God is interested in mending brokenness. Or miracles of feeding the 5,000 tell us God is interested in providing for us. So there are always multi-layered meanings for a miracle. Anyway, Thomas needed to see these wounds for proof. But what is fascinating is that it was Jesus who first identified himself by his wounds. And he does this in Luke's gospel too, as well as John's gospel. In Luke's account, when Jesus appears to his disciples, he said, I'm not a ghost. Obviously, they're looking terrified, right? He says, I'm not a ghost. Don't be afraid. Look at my hands and look at my feet. So he's saying, look, I'm the same one. I have these wounds here. You see where the marks were. This is where I was hung on the cross. Now, what's fascinating about that is, think about it. This is kind of intriguing. The risen Christ has wounds and scars. Why? Wouldn't you expect the risen, resurrected one to be perfect? Without any blemish? Does Jesus carry his wounds the way that we carry ours? Because I think we all have wounds. You can't live in this world for long. You can't live in this world for long and not be wounded in many different ways, right? The first time somebody breaks your heart, it's a wound. The first time you betray someone, it's a wound, a scar. The first time you feel abandoned, there's a scar, there's a wound. And I think in some ways, many of the griefs, many things stay with us. They maybe don't hurt us at the same level, but they stay with us. We carry our brokenness, our wounds and our scars. And some of us might have wounds like Thomas, which would be, he was depressed, he was crushed, he was struck by the grief of Jesus' death to the point where he just sort of gave up. He just sort of gave up. I think many of us can relate to that feeling of sometimes you just feel like giving up, right? Maybe one of the reasons that Jesus wanted them to see his hands and feet, I think it was more than simple proof, because I don't think that you can prove anything in some ways. I think it was more than proof that he was alive. There's many ways that they could have seen that Jesus was alive. They could have looked into his eyes and recognized him. They could have gazed upon his face and recognized him. They didn't have to see the wounds. They might have recognized his voice, right? There's many ways that you could recognize someone. You wouldn't have to see the scars. You wouldn't have to see the wounds in his hands. No, I think there's something else going on here. I think that by showing them all his hands, he's saying, these wounds didn't destroy me. I think it's a way of saying, ultimately, the final wound, which of course is death, does not get the last word with God. It's almost like by showing them his hands, his side, his feet, he's saying, I went through danger, not around it. He uses the phrase a lot, I'm moving toward Jerusalem. I think in that phrase, that's what he's meaning. I'm moving toward whatever I need to move toward. I'm not going to circumvent this. I faced it, I lived it, I experienced, I died. I walked into the valley of the shadow of death. And I came out the other side. I was not consumed by it. I was not consumed by it. Look at my wounds. Look what God did through them. Actually, there's a wonderful verse in Isaiah 55 that says, surely He has taken our infirmities, which is an old word that means frailty. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, and by his wounds we are healed. Which is a beautiful, poetic way of talking about some of what happened on the cross. You know, Jesus is showing us that these wounds didn't destroy me. God had the final word. Remember this, because your wounds will not destroy you. It's like, I'm going first, you'll follow. So it's like we can look at the wounds in our own life and hold on to that promise. The wounds don't get the last word with God. Wounds of grief, wounds of confusion, anger, it doesn't matter what it is. They don't get the last word. They don't get to destroy, in other words. Wounds of addiction, wounds of poverty, or, well, just now we're dealing with a pandemic, but we've had pandemics before. We had SARS, we had Ebola, we had AIDS, we've got global warming, we've got endless violence, we've got refugees all over the globe, all over the planet. I mean, there's so much suffering. The wounds of Christ say suffering and destruction does not have the final word. Doesn't get the last word. The cross shows us this, that something so hopeless, something so final, something that looks like a defeat, the end is not the end. It's like this great reversal that happens. And the same is true in our lives. Within the scars, with the scars we carry, with the wounds we carry, they don't get the last word. They don't get the last word because we're Easter people. The cross gets the last word, and the cross is empty, by the way. That's the beauty of the cross. The cross is empty. Nobody's hanging on it, right? Nobody's hanging on it because the wounded healer is up and about and walking among us. Now, yes, sometimes it's hard to see. There's no doubt about that. That's why Jesus is always saying to us, for those who have eyes to see, let them see. In other words, you're going to have to develop another way of looking at things, another way of seeing the world. And you have to develop your eyes of faith. Otherwise, you're going to get very discouraged. But the wounded healer is up and walking about among us. So I want to encourage you with that this first week after Easter. That even in the midst of this apparent chaos, nothing is chaotic to God. This is the one who brings order out of chaos. Remember in Genesis? Order comes out of chaos. Amen.
As the deer longs for running streams, so I long, so I long, so I long for you. Thirsts my soul for you, the God who is my life. When shall I see? When shall I see? sweeping on in. As the deer longs for running streams, so I long, so I long, so I long for you. Defend me, God, send forth your life and your truth. They will lead me to your holy mountain, to your dwelling place. As the deer longs for running streams, so I long, so I long, so I long for you. Then shall I go to the altar of my God, praising you, all my joy and gladness I shall praise your name. As the deer longs for running streams, so I long, so I long, so I long for you.
In regard to our offering, I want to thank those of you who have mailed your offerings in. I want to thank those of you who have used your bank. Either way, we are happy to receive, and it is particularly encouraging as we go through this time of uncertainty to come in each day and check the mail and see your faithfulness. So thank you for those of you who are continuing to support us. We're going to have a time of prayer now, and the prayers that I say during our shelter in place are more general than our usual prayers that we say as a congregation, because I do want to protect the privacy of individuals since YouTube is a public platform. So they are a little different. However, please know that I keep you all in my personal prayers. So let us pray. Our gracious God, for the sick and infected, heal and help, sustain bodies and spirits, contain the spread of infection. For the hospital staff, the police, the firefighters, all who are helping. In your mercy, Lord, hear our prayers. For vulnerable populations, the elderly, those suffering from chronic diseases, for the poor, the uninsured, for the young and the strong, give them the necessary caution to keep them from unwittingly spreading this disease. Inspire them to help. Lord, in your mercy. For our local state, our federal governments, God, help our elected officials as they allocate the necessary resources for combating this pandemic. Help them to provide more tests for our scientific community, leading the charge to understand this disease. Give them knowledge, wisdom, a persuasive voice. For our media, committed to providing up-to-date information, help them to communicate with appropriate seriousness without causing panic. For those with mental health challenges who feel isolated, anxious, and helpless, provide them with every necessary support. For the homeless, for missionaries throughout the world, especially those serving in areas of high infection. Provide them with words of hope and equip them to love and serve those around them. For workers in a variety of industries facing layoffs and financial hardship, keep them from panic and inspire your church to generously support them. For families with young children at home for the foreseeable future, help mothers and fathers to partner together creatively for the care and nourishing of their children. For single mothers, single fathers, grow their network of support. For parents who cannot stay home from work but must find care for their children, God, present them with creative solutions. In your mercy, Lord, thank you for hearing our prayers. Peace be with you.